Hi, and welcome to the Forum. My name is Pastor Kenny Montano from Roy Bible Church in Roy, Utah, and I'm filling in today for Sean, who is our normal host, but he's a little under the weather, so he's asked me to step in, and I'm glad to do it today on the Forum. The Forum is a show here on TV20 where we like to take a topic and that's kind of happening in pop culture, things that are going on in our world today, and ask a few pastors from our area how Christians should respond to those things, how we should have a Christian response to current events and to issues that people are talking about, probably things that you're talking about at home and at work and at school. And so we want to do that today. Let me introduce our panel for today. We have a great, bright panel of pastors today. Today we have Justin Gort with us from Cornerstone Bible in Clinton. How are you doing?
Well, very well, thank you.
Great to have you on the panel today. We have Jeremy Bear from Refuge Church in Riverdale, Utah. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
And Andy Bird, who a lot of you know as a host here on the channel TV20 on Heart for the Lost. And so we're glad to have Andy as well.
Thank you.
Well, today's topic is a tricky one because it's one that people are talking about. Especially, we live so close to Colorado, and the issue is marijuana. And this is going to become more and more, I think, an issue of topic around us. I don't see Utah being a state that probably will legalize marijuana anytime soon, but we know right next door it has, and I'm sure there are people from Utah driving across the border to procure things. I'm just assuming. California, places like that, but all across the country, laws are being changed and passed. So we kind of want to delve into this topic among some different areas, some different points of view. And the first view, I would think, is there a Christian response to just marijuana in general, before we get to the idea of what we do if there's a law passed or all this kind of thing. What do we say about marijuana in general, and especially in relationship to other maybe legal drugs like alcohol and other things like that? Is there a difference with marijuana? Are they the same? Are there some principles? Where do we go in the Scripture to help us understand these things? Justin, you want to maybe start us off with a few ideas?
Absolutely. I think we should run away and hide and find a cave to live in. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We need to, first of all, take into consideration that this is not new. I mean, this has been a plant that has been around for thousands of years. And it's a plant that's created by God. So it serves some purpose. Does that mean it serves a mood-altering purpose is something that we as Christians should look at, not from a personal opinion standpoint, from a biblical standpoint, though. What does the Bible say about food and drinking, and what does it say about our responsibility as people of God? And I would say, turning to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that the body is not for food. You know, God did in Genesis chapter 1 give us every seed-bearing plant for food, but that's not what we are all about as Christians. And we'll get in more detail about that, I assume, later.
But Justin brings up a good point, Jeremy, and that's one of the arguments from some. Let's say, well, this is a plant. It's natural. It's not like we're having to go through some chemical process like you would have to do with other drugs or even alcohol. I think to some degree that it's a natural process, but it's a process. This is something you just pick up off the side of the road and light up and have a good time. How do you respond to those people? Where do you go if you had someone in your church who is thinking about this questioning? I'm sure you do have, especially young people, asking these questions as they hear topics go around.
Yeah. No, I think, where Paul said, and doesn't directly apply, but he's like, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. And it's an issue of wisdom, and with it being something that, God created, after the fall, I would say, we see human beings abusing creation. So that's actually one of the vegan arguments, even for not even eating meat and supporting the corporations like meat industries and stuff like that, is because of their abuse of creation. And so I would say that it kind of applies in that same area where, yeah, maybe it's created by God, but not everything that was created by God is meant to be used for our own selfish desires and gain for ourselves, So if it was created by God, are you using it and stewarding it in the way that God would want you to use it and steward it for His glory? And that's a great point you just brought up, that the body's not made for food. It's made for God and for His glory. And so are you using it for those purposes? That's kind of what I would say to that.
Okay. Andy, what do you think? Is there a place for that, or do we risk becoming legalistic when we take hard stances on something like this? Where's the danger?
I think the idea is wisdom, right? So I think that if you look from the biblical precedents here, you're looking at wisdom, and you're looking at doing things that, you know, we don't want to get legalistic, but we can very easily here. So I think there's a different perspective you take with a Christian believer. So if a Christian came to me and said, this is something I'm thinking about doing, there would always be the what and the why and the how is that going to affect you? What type of impact are you looking for there? Because sometimes we solve problems by looking at the actual problem itself instead of looking at what the end result is. So if somebody came and their intent was because they had cancer or something like that, we have a whole different scenario to walk through at that point in time. So wisdom takes application here. The other thing that we have to be really, really careful of is we tend to over-demonize certain things too. And so a lack of understanding in this area, especially with this particular thing, would allow Christians to get to the point where we demonize it. We call it something that it's not, right? It does have medicinal use. It does have other proper uses, including making clothing and whatnot. And I'm not a big hemp fan, just so everybody knows. I have no desire whatsoever. So I don't know how the panel feels. I take a glass of scotch any day of the week over anything else if I'm going to have one of those. But the idea here is we can't demonize things so far that we start to alienate people, and that would be outside the church. So inside the church, counseling someone, I think, is different than outside the church.
Mm-hmm. So outside the church, then, Justin, the question comes, not that it's happening anytime soon, but say the Salt Lake, the state legislature is coming up and talking about this, and they're discussing it. Whereas a lot of Christians in other states find themselves in positions like this, and maybe on a national scale we'll eventually find ourselves. Do Christians have an obligation to speak out against legalization? What about medicinal marijuana? Where's our responsibility not only within the church, but outside the church in responding to changing of laws?
I love that you brought up wisdom. James 1:5, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. What a great reminder. And so Christians can come two ways about this. We can come saying, this is terrible, it's going to ruin society, and everything we know is going to fall apart. Now, that's not wisdom, that's fear. Mm-hmm. And then we also come to the other side and say, everything's fine, just go for it, do whatever you want. That's not wisdom either. I was in high school, 3 of my friends were killed. The man was tested positive for marijuana. They didn't conclude that he had smoked marijuana to cause the accident, but it was in his system at the time. I would say, while it was not charged against him, his judgment may have not been the best. So as we look at these things, what is best for a society? Wisdom would say, let's tax the $8 to $10 billion industry that's happening in Southern California, and let's get taxes off that. But let's also make sure that we're being wise to protect children, so that if somebody is toking or hitting a bong, that there's not a 2-year-old walking around who is in relation getting high as well. So I think there's a lot of aspects that we need to look at, and wisdom needs to prevail.
I can't believe you just used the word toking. I
I
love
It's very relevant.
Is that a biblical term?
Well, so do you feel the same way, Jeremy? That is there a difference whenever we interact with the culture at large, as we've been talking about, than when we're interacting with those in our own churches?
Yeah, I think like with what he's saying, whenever, the spiritual law with sin is sin corrupts and deteriorates, and so whenever we use anything for our own glory and for selfish desires, it's going to deteriorate God's creation, and you see it and stuff like that. That you sow to the flesh, you reap corruption. That's just, it's one of those natural or spiritual laws. But as far as the world goes, like on this topic, like I'll on the things that we're going to really speak out on, I think I would be careful to really pick those hills that I'm going to die on. Like if we were talking about abortion, that's a totally different issue. But with something like this, I kind of go the route of, like Paul said, I claim to know nothing except for Christ and Him crucified when it comes to the world. Because a lot of times, I think people who are not believers, they go, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? And they're asking all these different kind of topical questions, when really it's like they're going to write you off anyway. They really don't care about these things. It's just, I want to look for a reason to kind of write you off as a Christian. And at that point, it's like, you know what? Let's talk about really what is really important, and that's your salvation. Let's talk about your heart and how you've broken God's law. You know, not even necessarily this, but just from the inside out, like your heart and your desires. You've broken God's law, and you need the forgiveness that's found in Christ alone. Let's talk about that. You know, and all these other issues. It's like, yeah, I can give you maybe some opinions, but I'm not going to die on this hill. You know, I will stand for this, and that's the gospel. That's how I would kind of treat this thing outside of the church. I think is being about Jesus Christ and Him crucified and telling Him about.
So, as someone who has a heart for the lost, Andy, how do we as believers, when we're in conversation with other people, particularly those who aren't Christians, and they're maybe baiting us, as Jeremy said, into wanting that sort of what they think of as that typical sort of fundamentalist, stereotypical, legalistic answer, maybe that they think that's what we're going to give, whatever their perception of Christianity is. How do we turn that to a conversation about grace, to a conversation about the gospel? How do we, because this is things that people are going to be talking about, and I think water cooler subject material is stuff that we ought to be looking for ways to share the gospel with people. So how do you turn a conversation about marijuana and legalization of marijuana into an issue of the gospel?
Sure. It's the core of the issue, right? Going back to the why. Why do you feel like you need this? Well, and I don't want to use the same old, there's a hole in your heart type of thing, but you're trying to fill a need, right? There's a gap that you're trying to fill. Something is amiss. And when the core changes, as my friend over here said, when that heart change happens, then these other issues become much more peripheral. I mean, I have not talked to that many internal in the church that have gone through a struggle with marijuana, right? It's not going to happen as much just because we have that core change. So I would start that conversation off with why? Why is marijuana so important to you? What is the deal? Because typically, it's just because they want to take a stand on something, right? They want to go to a side just to go to that side. Now, where Christians play in that political arena, I think is a bigger question, and it's not a hill I would die on. And I don't know how much we should be legislating that. I mean, I'll leave that for smarter people to decide, but sometimes our influence in that arena actually deteriorates the gospel because they view us, you know, as being really, really orthodox in areas that we probably don't really need to be that orthodox in. I would much rather die on other hills because that makes more sense. So I would explain that to them in that water cooler conversation. First of all, why do you want to go? Why do you need marijuana? What is it that's going on? Because there's probably a deeper issue somewhere there. People who use that are using it because they believe it's medicinal. I travel to Denver a lot, so I get the whole, everybody's using it for medicinal purposes, whether it's a headache or they've got a freckle on their ear. I mean, I'm serious. Everybody's using it. So I get that. So, but usually it's because something in their life is amiss. And they need God just like anybody else. So that usually leads to a more heartfelt conversation of drawing them out of why they actually need that. And then we can get to the whole idea of, well, listen, the reason that you feel like you need that is because you've sinned against God and He offers His grace to you. And you get into that type of a conversation. I want to make that one last point, though. If we as Christians legislate on things that are not as important, we have to have a hierarchy of priority, right? Of the things that are important to us. If we legislate on these things, we will never be taken seriously on these things. And so that's one thing that I get worried about.
Yeah, we want to make people, or not make people, we want people to know what we're about, not what we're against.
That's right.
Yeah, and
I love that
we're
statement.
about Jesus, and we're about the gospel. And, and a lot of times I think the unbelieving world knows more about what we're against than what we're for, and that's Jesus. And even on, like, with that question, like, how do you turn this issue to pointing to the gospel? Like my own personal story, I was saved when I was 20, you know, and I smoked pot a lot, you know, like I enjoyed it, but the heart, like just what you were saying, like just from personal experience, the heart behind it was, I did it because it was illegal. I did it because there was when the law tells you not to do something, the flesh goes, I want to do that, you know, and so I did it because I was like, cast off restraint, they're telling me not to do it, I'm going to do it anyway. And that's a huge open door for the gospel. Absolutely. Like, why do you think it is that you want to do something that the law says not to do, in the states that it's illegal, that's because there's something wrong with your heart. Like that we are so contrary to governing authorities and ultimately to God, who is the ultimate authority. We are so contrary to that. Do you see? Like, we need to be fixed, you know? And so that was one of the things that God actually used to bring me to Christ, was there's something wrong with your heart. And it's that you're a sinner, and that's why you sin, is because it's a nature thing. And it's like, I need Jesus.
It's a symptom of something larger, right?
Yeah.
When you want to buck against authority like that, which I'm with you. That's how I grew up. That's what I wanted to do in every aspect, is I wanted to buck against authority. It's a symptom. So this is just one of those indicators, one of those signs that you see that yet another person, like everybody, needs Jesus.
Comes from the beginning of Adam and Eve rebelling in the garden, and here we are still rebelling in the garden.
Yeah.
Yes,
and we're eating forbidden fruit, and we're maybe we're smoking it now,
right? Absolutely.
But it's indicative of the heart of man being sinful, inclined away from God and towards self, and all those sorts of things. Well, maybe the conversation changes then to what may very well happen. And maybe one day there's a Supreme Court decision or something, and with the amount of states that legalize marijuana on their own, maybe it becomes legal everywhere in the United States. Then what do we do, Justin? You're a pastor. Someone in your church, you get a new member in your church, or someone in your church says, "Oh, marijuana is legal now," and I wouldn't have done it when it was illegal, and I maybe wouldn't have even driven across a border to go get it. I wouldn't have thought that would have seemed like rebellion. But now it's legal here. Why can't I enjoy something that the government says is legal? There's no specific verse in the Bible about it, is there? How do we understand? How do we instruct people with? Is there a difference between, even if we have a strong stance on alcohol, not to change the subject to alcohol, but is there even a difference between different types of things that can alter your mind? And how do we understand that? Should marijuana become legal?
I would say that marijuana would be easily likened to the issue of alcohol, the issue of meat offered to idols, or the issue of meat in general in Romans 14. And so we can look at, for instance, Romans chapter 14. We can turn there, and we can see what God says in Romans chapter 14, verses 19 and 20, that God has a plan, He has a purpose, and He has something in order for us to know Him better by, and to encourage one another. And here's what it says in Romans chapter 14, 19 and 20. So then, let us pursue the things which make for peace, and the building up of one another. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things are indeed clean, all things are indeed clean, but they are evil for the man who eats and gives offense. So I would say that would be my answer to the believer who comes to me and says, "Hey, Pastor, I want to do this." I would say, well, first of all, is it best? You are lawful in Christ to not sin. Christ has freed us from sin. Now, if this is not a sin issue for you, if you can do it by faith, if you can do it without impacting others negatively, is it best? And I would come down personally on no, it's not best. But that's my stance. Now, would I legislate that for the believers at Cornerstone Bible Church? I would warn them that it's not best and it's not going to build up the body, but I wouldn't say you can't smoke marijuana and be a member of Cornerstone Bible Church.
Is there a difference between, the idea, people have brought this up, you hear this question, is there a difference between alcohol, which you can drink without getting intoxicated, and marijuana, which kind of the whole point of it is to have sort of an intoxication? Is there biblical wisdom with that? What do you think, Jeremy?
With that, I just want to reference, Mark Driscoll did a little ebook for free. It's kind of cool. It's called Puffer Pass, and it's directly for Christians. Should believers, when it becomes legal, because it is legal in Seattle, and where he pastors, and he wrote this little booklet, Puffer Pass. Should Christians smoke marijuana? And he gives a lot of statistics from doctors on that. Is it the same as alcohol? What are the effects of marijuana? And just from personal experience after reading it, I was like, I don't think these guys have ever smoked pot. I don't think they ever have. But I know that, again, just from personal experience, that your judgment is impaired quick, really quick. And like with alcohol, it depends on the alcohol. There are different types of alcohol that you're your judgment isn't as impaired as quick, you know. But with smoking pot, it's impaired pretty quick, and you are not in your right frame of mind, you know. And so for me, like, as talking to a Christian, you know, is this something I should do? Again, it comes down to that wisdom thing. Romans 14, great section to look at for that. But there are also calls in Scripture for us as believers to be sober-minded and to be thinking clearly. And really, in 1 Peter, he talks a lot about being ready because the Lord can appear at any moment. You know, and Jesus told parables about this, about the stewards of the grounds that God left them to, you know, and the master came and found them not ready, like just drinking and not in their right mind. And I can say just from personal experience, like if Jesus showed up when I was high on pot, I would be going, oh crap. You know, like
you would not have been ready.
No, I would not have been ready. I would not have been sober. I would not have been glorifying God. That's just, you know, kind of what I think on that. So I don't think as believers, even if it was legal, I don't think it's the best thing to do at all.
Yeah.
You know, as far as a witness, as far as like being ready and doing the Lord's work. That's just my
that mindset's radical for every believer today, because now we're saying, look at all of your life. You know, is watching Breaking Bad? I don't watch Breaking Bad, but is watching Breaking Bad okay? Or if Jesus comes back and finds me watching Breaking Bad,
how about
is that
prescription
best?
drugs?
Or prescription drugs.
So, you know, some people take 4 ibuprofen or 4 Advil when the recommended dose is 2. Do we get into the same conversation with them? Because I know for me, I'm very sensitive to that type of stuff. So if I take 4 ibuprofen, I'm la-la. I mean, it really affects me. And so each individual is affected by this different. The one thing about marijuana that might be a little bit different, where we have a different conversation, is it's different to moderate. So unless you are highly experienced with it, from what I've been told by guys like you, is that it's a finer line for the moderation. Whereas a drink, much might be, and maybe it's just because it's been in society for so long, is much more simplistic. I know that 1 drink puts me at this level, or 2 drinks would put me at that level. So I know where my thresholds are as an individual, and I know where those thresholds are for people around me. I know how much, for say, my wife could drink if she did so on a regular basis. And so I know what that level is. Marijuana is a little bit different to moderate, especially being newly introduced for so many people. That one's going to be a little bit different of a challenge. And the consumption model is different, right? Smoking it is a little bit different than drinking it. Drinking it can be in a container. It might be safer for others around, where marijuana does impact other people. So we just have to be, again, going back to wisdom, we have to be mindful of that. But we also, at the same token, and I'll flip myself on the other side, we don't do this with prescription drugs. So we start to get into a moderation thing because the consumption model and the moderations might be different in the way that we handle them, but we don't do this with prescription. And I've known people who have been addicted to painkillers for 40 years and been quote-unquote believers, even within the church, even leaders of churches, for that entire amount of time. And yet they have not ever been held, you know what I mean? The accountability effort for them is a lot different than it would be in this regard. So we just need to do that. Now, the final thing I'll say is, I think the real question is what if somebody brings brownies to the potluck or to the church table? That would be a big concern, right? Because we don't want the entire church listening to a sermon and eating unknown brownies. That would be a problem.
But we laugh about it, but those are things that become real possibilities, you know, in the not too distant future.
Sure.
And for believers living in places like
Denver
or other parts of the country where things are being more radically legalized. Well, those are real questions, especially if you have new believers, young believers in church who don't see anything wrong with that. Is this from a parental standpoint? Is this something that parents need to be talking to their kids about? How do you talk about that with your kids? You know, what's the right age to be talking about not just marijuana, but all things that have the potential to be addictive, all things that, you know, and how do you present that in a way that is like this discussion that we've been having, that avoids trying to say, creating new laws in the sand and that sort of thing, but trying to teach biblical principles to our kids, because that's really, it's going to be the next generation really that's probably going to have to deal with this even more than us.
Yeah.
Parents always need to be talking about freedom and responsibility. You know, in America we are free to do almost anything we want, but we're also responsible to provide for ourselves and provide for our families. But in the Christian life, even more so, we are free to follow God. We are free to glorify God where we weren't before. So the Christian parent needs to disciple his child or her child in order to bring them closer to Christ, to walk in line with Christ. If they are believing children, then especially needs to be guiding them to be responsible Christians. And people take that to mean very different things, but responsible means you are building up the body. You are using your gifts and talents for the glory of God. And for some, that means abstaining completely from alcohol, marijuana, a host of other things. For others, that means they can see, all right, I have liberty in Christ to partake of alcohol. It's never explicitly said, don't do it as a believer. So I can, but I'm not going to do it in this setting. But over here, in my private home, with my private believing friends who also partake, I can drink. Now, I personally don't fall in that camp, but I understand that for those, my believing friends who do, it's not sin for them to do so. And I don't need to look down on them if they don't do things my way. But responsibility and freedom need to be going hand in hand. And we need to be teaching that in the church and without.
Law and grace is this continual, it's kind of what we come back to always as Christians, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think even like with what he's saying, discipling our kids, I have a 2 and a 4-year-old, so I'm not like this well of wisdom on raising teenagers who are going to be, introduced to some of this stuff. And
2 more years.
Yeah, but I will be. But I think the earlier you disciple your kids, the better. The sooner you start disciplining disobedience and rewarding and encouraging obedience, and even going deeper than that when there's disobedience, explaining to them why, explaining to them their heart. Like my 4-year-old right now, he can tell you the gospel. I don't think he's saved, but he can tell you the gospel, and he can tell you why his heart is naughty. I'm and who can help him with it. And why he was made. For God. He was created for God. And so then those conversations, I think, later in life is just simply a reminder of, hey, why were you made? Why did God make you? He made you to have relationship with Him and to be in relationship and glorify Him. Do you think that this is something that is going to glorify God? Are you doing it for your friends? Are you doing it for them? Because then it's a whole other issue. Are you doing it for God? And so those conversations in my home, I think, because of the earlier kind of, I want to instill this in them, might be easier. I can't say that because I'm not there yet, but might be easier because the groundwork has hopefully been laid. But
about 30 seconds left. Andy, what's your final word? Wrap it up.
I'd say it just goes back to wisdom. Let's not legislate things we don't need to legislate. And I think Christians outside in that political spectrum should be very wary of how high we put this issue. But internally, for each individual, I think wisdom has to be applied. And if we don't apply that wisdom and teach it to our children, then we're left with just the free-for-all that gets people into trouble. And so that's how I would apply it in every situation that I look at. And I'd always go back to the why and get to the heart of the individual.
Yeah, certainly a conversation we should be having. And you can continue the conversation as you not only listen to this episode, but share with others. Maybe that's something you'd like to do. You can find all of our episodes on YouTube. It's youtube.com/forumtv20. You can comment there and leave suggestions. You can also send us an email if you have questions or comments at forumtv20@gmail.com. We want to thank our panel for being here today, and we want to thank you for joining us today on The Forum.